patience. It's going to be a big part of how we deal skillfully with the current situation we're in, because I think we're going to be with this coronavirus for quite a while. And anyway, patience is something that we should learn in our ordinary lives to make our lives better. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. I'll be talking about patience today. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. One part of living a wiser and kinder and calmer life is to live a more patient life. I have to admit that one of my biggest failings is that I tend to be very impatient. It's one of my bigger failings, I'll put it that way. Buddhism, they often talk about hell realms and heaven realms. For me, one of the hell realms would be waiting in a long line for something. That's one of the ways that gets me. And it's not something that's to my own benefit. And so I'm learning this particular technique and strategy as much as I'm sure some of you are. Now, what I would say is that patience is one of the 10 perfections, or paramis or paramita, that we find in later in Mahayana Buddhism. We find it in later Pali Buddhism and the Theravada tradition. But it was not part of any kind, the paramis in general were not part of early Buddhism. That came later. And in general, patience is not it's not added to any lists or any of the major lists anyway that I'm familiar with of early Buddhism. So we could say it wasn't quite as centrally understood as important to the path as it became later. Now, why exactly this is the case, I'll just sort of do a little bit of a historical digression here before we get to the actual issues here. But I think one of the issues, or one of the historical issues with patience, is that later on, the idea of awakening became quite expanded. And so whereas in the early tradition, awakening was sort of understood to be something that at least a diligent monastic could potentially expect to gain within this very life, or at least in a few lives anyway. In the later tradition, that tended to shift in the sense that awakening became something that was more and more difficult to achieve. And indeed, in the Mahayana, the awakening that we find in early Buddhism was sort of replaced by the desire to become a Buddha. And of course, becoming a Buddha is something of a different scale entirely. And so, all of a sudden, the aim of practice was really quite a bit farther away from us than it had been when Buddhism began. And I think in that context, patience became extremely important, because we had, after all, to wait potentially many, not only many lifetimes, but potentially many billions and billions of years to be expecting to get to a stage like becoming a Buddha or something. And that's the way it's described. So patience took on quite a different character later on as being central to the path. Now, within early Buddhism, which is really the focus of this channel and the focus of my interest, patience, or the issues surrounding patience, tend to involve, in particular, the abuse of monastics. That is to say, monastics, monks, when they went out into the broader society, would encounter pushback sometimes, either verbal abuse or physical abuse. And so the idea of patience is one of tolerating that kind of reaction, tolerating abuse. And in particular, well, there are a number of particulars, but one early story, involves Punna, who is a monastic who is going off into the country of Sunaparanta, which is, the Buddha describes as a difficult place, a place full of people who are perhaps not very open to the Buddha Dharma. And so the Buddha wants to examine Punna to make sure that that his mind is in the right place. And so the Buddha asks him, basically, if somebody abuses you verbally, how are you going to take that? And Punna says that if somebody abuses him verbally, he's going to be very pleased that they're not at least hitting him with, let's say, with sticks or throwing stones at him. And the Buddha then asks, well, what if they throw stones at you or hit you with sticks? Then Punna says, well, I'll be very pleased that they're not at least using a knife on me. And it goes in that kind of progression until the Buddha gets to the possibility that somebody would try to kill him or kill him. He says, what if somebody kills you? And Punna says, well, within the Sangha nowadays, there are some monastics who are very ill, in very deep pain, and are looking for some way to commit suicide, basically. But they don't want to do that to engender the bad karma. And here I am in this foreign country, this difficult country, and somebody is allowing me to commit suicide without me having to take bad karma on myself. And so even then, he says he would be pleased. So, I mean, this is a very powerful kind of progression, let's say, a powerful discussion here of deep, deep patience, of tolerance with anything. I mean, patience and tolerance are both basically two ways to describe the same kind of mental toughness, shall we say. This ability to tolerate anything. And indeed, the Buddha does approve of Punna's mental toughness in this case, and happily tells Punna to go on his way, and indeed it seems that Punna was very successful. There's another story in another sutta about the housewife Vedehika and her maid Kali. And in this story, the housewife Vedehika is very sweet, very even-tempered, we might say very patient, tolerant. But Kali notices that she, the maid, is always doing her work properly. She's very diligent, she always arrives on time, she always gets her work done. And so Kali thinks to herself, well, is my mistress, this woman who's the householder, is she really patient, or is it just that I'm doing my work properly? So Kali decides to test the housewife. She decides that what she's going to do is to arrive late. She's not going to do her work diligently. She's going to make intentional mistakes. We can make of this story what we will. It doesn't seem like the best idea, but in any event, that's what Kali decides to do. And as the story tells it, indeed, when Kali does this, Vedehika becomes very irate, becomes abusive, indeed becomes eventually physically abusive. And so Kali then denounces the housewife as being somebody who isn't really patient, who isn't really sweet and kind and tolerant. All that she was doing was tolerating somebody who was doing their work properly. But she wasn't really tolerant when you got down to it. And I think that is, in telling this story, the Buddha is pointing out how it's very easy for all of us to be patient when things go right. A few minutes ago, I was talking about being in long lines. Well, if there isn't a line, then obviously we can all imagine that we'd be patient in that situation, because there's nothing really to be patient about. We don't really have to wait for anything. We don't really have to tolerate anything. Where, the rubber hits the road, as they say, where things get, where you really find out, is where you have to deal with something that is perhaps more difficult to tolerate, such as an employee who is not doing their job properly, or some piece of equipment that isn't working, or an employer who is not paying you properly, or who is perhaps abusing your tendency to work too much. There are many different ways that we can approach this problem, but the point here is clear, which is that we have to be careful in thinking of ourselves as patient when we aren't really being tested. And indeed, perhaps now we are being tested, at least to some small degree for most of us who are simply having to wait at home or not being able to do things that we like to do. And in this same sutta where the Buddha discusses this story of this housewife and the maid, he's using this to describe basically patience to his monastics. And later on in the sutta, this is a very famous sutta, because at the end of the sutta, the Buddha discusses because the general idea of this sutta is that monastics are being verbally abused, or having to deal with verbal issues about how language is being used. And the Buddha then sort of ups the ante here at the end and says that, look, even if you were to be taken physically by bandits who would, and this is a very, very powerful example here, he says, even if they would basically take you limb from limb with a two-handled saw, with a large saw, just cut you into pieces, he says, even in that situation, you should remain tolerant, that is to say, with a mind of kindness towards them, that you should not allow your mind to be turned towards hatred, even in the most difficult of situations. And now I've heard a number of contemporary teachers who have approached this teaching in different directions, some who have said that we really shouldn't take this entirely seriously. My own sense is that it was indeed intended to be taken entirely seriously by the Buddha. Now, of course, he's using an extreme case to make the point about the comparative minor issues of language. I mean, in other words, if you can deal with some terrible thing like being cut to pieces, then language seems, by comparison, to be very minor. And so therefore, those of you who are getting angry about language are really, you've got a lot to learn, according to the Buddha, basically. But the point here in all of these cases is that a tolerance and patience is something that we have to even maintain in the most trying of circumstances. And when we compare that very trying circumstance to our contemporary circumstance, which is really, for the vast majority of us, is really nothing much, except that we have to remain at home, perhaps not do some things that we would enjoy doing. When we compare that to this other horrible possibility, or the horrible possibility, frankly, of getting the illness and having to be in the hospital or even die, then we see that there's certainly a much more room for patience and tolerance. It's instructive to note that in these cases, patience, the idea of patience, is generally contrasted with anger or hatred. That is to say, patience is kind of a counteracting of anger or hatred. And indeed, the Buddha says that people who are without patience are people who tend to be of ill will, tend to be angry, tend to be dislikable. They're difficult to deal with. They have trouble making friends because, again, their anger tends to bubble up all the time. They become disagreeable and cruel, and as a result, as I say, they become difficult to like. Whereas the Buddha also says, he compares this to the case of somebody who is patient, and he says the patient person is much more likable, is much more agreeable, as opposed to being disagreeable, because they're able to tolerate so much. And indeed, tolerance is so important when it comes to friendship, because as I'm sure all of us know, I'm sure you know, one of the issues about being human, frankly, is that we find ourselves in constant disagreements with those people around us, even the people closest to us, even our spouses, even our family, oftentimes very much our family, even close friends. We find ourselves in disagreements. And to the extent to which we're intolerant, we're unable to tolerate things that don't go our way or that are in disagreement with us, that makes it very difficult to have long-term friendships or to have any friendships at all. And indeed, for the monastic sangha, it makes it difficult to maintain such a thing if people are going to be intolerant of each other. So the major issue here is one of overcoming anger, overcoming intolerance by practicing patience. And part of the way to do that is to see the advantages of a patient lifestyle, the advantages of getting away from anger. And how do we deal with that in this particular case that we're confronted with now, this coronavirus? Well, it can certainly help to realize that these are universal issues, that this is not something special to today. It's not something special to 2020 or 2021 or however long this virus goes on. These are issues that go back 2,500 years. And the Buddha was very clear in pointing out that having a patient mindset, or at least cultivating patience, which may involve understanding the roots of anger and trying to counteract those roots when we see them arising, to make peace with them in the sense of acknowledging their presence, because we don't want to suppress them. That would not help. They tend to come back. That leads to this issue of spiritual bypassing, which I've discussed before. I'll put a link to a video about that below. But we don't want to bypass them, but we want to become aware of them and do what we can to mitigate them. And to that extent, I have an earlier video on dealing with anger, which might be helpful in this context. I'll put a link to it up here on the screen. I hope you'll all remain well and healthy and safe, and I'll catch you on the next one of these videos.